Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. And now in this video, I will talk about DevOps. So the idea is to help someone who is planning to start their career as a DevOps engineer, because I get approached by a lot of people who ask me that they want to switch their career as a DevOps engineer, or they want to start learning DevOps and they don't know where to start. So in this video, I'll just briefly touch base on what is DevOps and what is a DevOps lifecycle and what tools you should learn if you really want to start your journey as a DevOps engineer. And then probably in next videos, I will start exploring more on those tools. So let's jump back in the video. Before starting, let me introduce myself. I'm Sushil. I have more than a decade of industry experience. I'm a certified cloud and DevOps architect, and I'm passionate about fitness and technology. And I write using my blog, thetechguy.in. Now, before starting with DevOps, before you really start jumping in DevOps, because when you start working as a DevOps engineer, you are obviously eventually going to start appearing for interviews, and you should really have your mindset clear why we really started working as a DevOps engineer. What was the need of starting the DevOps? Now, before starting the DevOps, you really have to understand what was the need, how it started. It started all with the agile and waterfall methodology. Now, I still see some of the organizations following waterfall, but now majority of the organizations have moved and have started using agile. But a long time ago, there used to be something called waterfall. Waterfall is nothing but, as the name suggests, it is actually like a waterfall where every step follows after the previous step is completed. Now, when you work on a product, when you're writing a code, when you're creating something, that is eventually a product that you're going to deliver to your client, right? So when you start working on a product, you start with the requirement gathering. Now, after your requirement gathering is done, you know what needs to be done. You start working with the design on how it will be created. Now, if you think about infrastructure, how your network will be designed, how your resource will be designed, how your subscriptions and environment will be designed, you start working on design and get all it approved and signed, and then you start writing and creating the development. Right now, once development is done, you go through the testing, because whatever you have developed, you don't really know that it will work in the production, or it will actually work as expected. If imagine if it is working, but you don't really know if it will be able to bear the load that it is expected to see, right? If you are an IPL fan, you would have seen Hotstar, right? Hotstar was running millions of users at a time. So that is whole idea of testing and making sure that it really performs when it is expected to perform. And once the testing is done, it is rolled out in the deployment phase. Now, in waterfall, everything used to work in silos, and once you have the requirements and eventually the deployment is done, there might be scenarios where deployment is really far-fetched from what the requirement and design was there. Now, if there is a situation like that, you don't really have a choice to go back, and you have to really start working on everything again and again, right? There was a lot of disconnects between. Now, that is where the agile came in. Now, what Agile said, okay, why you work on silos? Let's break it down in multiple sprints. Now, when I say sprints is nothing but the breaking down your overall product in cumulative cycles. For example, you break it in 3 sprints, and at the end of the sprint, you will have a deliverable which you expect at the end of sprint to complete. Now, what it did, as part of each sprint, usually companies or organizations follow a 2-week sprint, but again, depends on you how you want to follow. Now, at the end of 2 weeks, you will eventually have something to deliver and produce. Now, you would know if it is really meeting the expectations. If not, you can make it, create this as a backlog in your next sprint and start working on it. If you really think that it is what it was expected, then you learn from your mistakes and you improve, right? So that was whole agenda of agile. Now that is where the agile came in. And when we started working on agile, now if you see the requirement, you get the requirement, you design, you develop, test, and deploy. Now in this cycle, the developers and the operations really started collaborating and working and ensuring that you are eventually delivering the product that you're expecting to deliver. Now when you started working on agile, the whole understanding or the idea of DevOps also started. Now, what is really DevOps? DevOps is nothing but, in the full form, it is really developer and operations. So the idea is to bring developers and operations in conjunction and start working together instead of working in silos. That is the whole idea of development and operations teams to work in overall delivery. Now, when you start working in DevOps, there are multiple stages. You start working with deployment, you start working with testing. Then once testing is done, you work on release and deployment. Once the deployment is done, you start working on monitoring, feedback, and planning. Um, Planning actually starts first planning is done, then you start deployment and testing and blah blah blah. Now the whole idea is you get the planning, you create the deployment, development, you test it, you release it, and once you have released, you don't, I'm fine, we have done all the testing, we think it will work as it is expected to work, but you really don't know whether it is working as expected. That is where monitoring also comes in, right? That is the whole idea of monitoring. You monitor it, you configure monitoring and logging based on your requirement, and then you have your feedback and optimization in place. You have your feedback and optimization in place, which tells you whether it is working as it is expected to work. So that is the whole idea of DevOps, and that is where the DevOps came in. Now, once you start, now at least you have a fundamental idea of what is DevOps and why it all started. Now, when you think, you really want to start your journey as a DevOps engineer, what you really need to know is the DevOps lifecycle. What is DevOps lifecycle? What are the different phases? Because as a DevOps engineer, you should have an understanding of these phases, what these phases really do. And if you really want to become a successful DevOps engineer, you should at least know one tool in each of these stages, so that you can really talk and understand what is really going on in the entire life cycle. So DevOps lifecycle or principle, as I already mentioned, you start planning. Once planning is done, you start writing the code. I mean, you'll not really write the code as a DevOps engineer, but you should really understand what is written. You should be able to contemplate what developer is really trying to do, so that if the build is failing, you can at least try to understand why it is failing, and then give the feedback to the developer what it needs to be done, if at all there is a requirement. Now the coding is done, build is done. Once you've built, right, for example, you've written the code, you've written, I'll give you a simple example. You've written hello world, right? Now your computer doesn't know what you've written. You have to at least compile. Depends if the language is really compiler language, you really need to compile and build, or you just build it. But eventually the whole idea is you build it and create a sort of artifact which will be eventually released, right? So you plan it, you build it, sorry, you write the code, you build it. After you build, I've explained why you need to test. You test it. Once the testing is done, you'll mostly use some sort of automation testing in place. Once the testing is done, you release it in the required solution, or I'm not getting the word. You release it in the required infrastructure, for example, right? Depends where you want to release it, where you want to deploy it. It can be cloud, it can be on premises, it can be web app, it can be container, it can be microservices, depending on where you want to deploy it. Now once you've deployed, you also want to operate and monitor it, right? Because what is the use of creating an application when you don't even know it is working as expected, right? So you have some sort of monitoring in place also, which will tell you if the application is down. Now, let me give you a very hypothetical scenario. Let's assume we created a microservices application in a Kubernetes cluster, and somehow the cluster itself went down because of n number of reasons. There can be n number of reasons because of the cluster went down. There was a ransomware attack, or there was something else. Somebody deleted the cluster. Anything can happen. That is where monitoring comes in, and which tells you whether it is working as expected or not. So you should really know what all these stages are and what these stages do. Now once you start understanding these stages, The next step is you understand what is the CI/CD pipeline, what the pipeline really does, and why you really hear so much about the CI and CD process. Because when you talk about DevOps, people really boil it down to the CI/CD process and they don't really talk about anything else. That is why I talked about these lifecycle steps. But what is really CI and CD process? CI is nothing but the continuous integration. CI is nothing but the continuous integration. CD is nothing but the continuous delivery. CI is also called the build step. CD is also called the release step. So this step that you see, this step is actually the CI step, and this step is actually the CD step. Now in the CI, you also have your testing in place. So testing is usually the part of the CI step also, but you really deal with, as a DevOps engineer, you majorly deal with the CI and CD, and also some sort of infrastructure management, because it will be deployed in some sort of tool. So you have to have understanding of the infrastructure management, which I will cover in the next slides. So what is the CI/CD process? You know that we build it. So the CI is nothing but building, merging those code changes frequently and running automated tests to catch issues early. So the CI really involves your build and test, and CD really means deploying to the production, or depending on what environment you want. Now, why do we really use CI/CD? Is because first of all, it is faster. You've really automated it. Everything is working in conjunction, so there is really a lot of collaboration that is happening, and since this is automated, there is less scope of failure, and you have all the bugs and everything you can catch, right? Now, in this process, I'll not really deep dive on these things, but this is how it works. A developer or developers team really use some sort of version control, because that helps you track what is happening, who has made what changes. You can have your PR process and you can do whatever you want. You can compile and create a package. It is also called as an artifact. You package, you do some sort of testing, unit testing, UI testing, performance testing, depending what testing you want. You package with the instruction, and then you deploy it using the scripts, and you deploy it in an environment. Now, this is the critical part where you think, I want to start my journey as a DevOps engineer. How do I really start working as a DevOps engineer, right? So I mean, you would have seen this kind of tree online where people really talk about the tools and what all you should learn when you think about DevOps. But I'll just touch base on why you really need to learn all this. Now, as a DevOps engineer, you'll be dealing with a lot of infrastructure. When I say a lot of infrastructure, because you are running those build, you are deploying the infrastructure, you are monitoring it, you are operating it, you are really dealing with a lot of infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, you would have dealt with Windows a lot, but in the production, in the real scenarios, people really use Linux. Nobody uses Windows at all. So you should be really familiar with Linux and Unix. You should know at least basic commands, how to navigate through UI, how you can browse files, how you can check the mount points, how you can check the networking. So basically deal with the package managers for Linux, and with the basic commands, with file shares, mounts, operating system, user access, stuff like that. So basic Linux familiarity should be there. And once you're familiarized yourself with the Linux, you really have to know at least one cloud. AWS and Azure and GCP, these three are really, really picking up in the market. I mean, AWS has been a leader for a very long time, and Azure has also really catched up a lot. GCP is really growing exponentially. So AWS, Azure, or GCP, at least one. And once you learn one cloud, you really can understand the other cloud easily, because just the name changes, the terminology and the concept are still same. DevOps really can be used to deploy anywhere and manage anywhere, because that is the whole funda. But nowadays, majority focus is really on the cloud native development and cloud deployment. So start learning one of the cloud. You can start with the fundamental course first of all, and once you really are familiar with the cloud, you can then proceed and start learning on the associate journey on one of the cloud. Now, once you're familiar with all these things, then you start working on the automation side. When I say automation, because now you know infrastructure, now you know cloud, you really need to know how you're going to deploy your infrastructure resources on the cloud. And when I talk about DevOps, nothing is manual. Nothing is manual. When I say nothing is manual, everything is automated. So people deploy everything using code, which is also called infrastructure as a code, IAC as we call. In IAC, they start deploying code. Terraform is something that I will highly recommend, because Terraform is platform agnostic. You can use Terraform for any platform, but you can use AWS, CloudFormation, Chef, Ansible, Puppet also. Ansible, at least, yes. You should know at least Terraform and Ansible. Terraform is mandatory, Ansible is optional. Chef and Puppet are also optional, but if you are really starting the journey, start thinking about Terraform and Ansible. We jump on the CI/CD process. I already mentioned what is build, release, pipeline, and what are the process, but there are multiple tools that help you manage your CI/CD pipeline. Jenkins is one. There is Azure DevOps also. So start, if you know Jenkins, good enough. Jenkins is really powerful tool and is leading market. So Jenkins should be good enough. Jenkins is a open source. You can create your lab really freely, and similarly Azure DevOps is also freely available. So use either familiarize yourself with Jenkins or Azure DevOps. Then you start working on the containerization. Now when I talk about any production environment, now everything is really moving into containerization nowadays. You really think about containerization, how you would deal with the containers and microservices. So start learning I know these are a lot of tools, but that is how DevOps journey is. You really deal with a lot of tools, and because there are so many tools for each and every step, so you should at least know one tool for every step. Now for containerization, you have to familiarize yourself with Docker, but you don't really stop at Docker. You really learn Kubernetes, because everything eventually is microservices, but Kubernetes is based on Docker. It uses Docker as a containerization backend. So basically learn Docker and eventually learn Kubernetes. Web servers, you can learn. You should at least know Nginx or Apache. You should know how those web calls happen, and how you deal with Nginx and Apache. It is optional. Once you learn all this, you can really jump on the monitoring side. And for the monitoring, you can use Prometheus and Grafana. Prometheus and Grafana, again, freeware. You can use Prometheus and Grafana. Learn. Prometheus is nothing. Prometheus is just using the metrics. You really deal with Grafana a lot of time. Grafana, Dynatrace and stuff. Grafana is free. That is why I recommend Grafana to get you familiarized with monitoring. And the cluster manager, as I mentioned, Kubernetes. So learn Kubernetes, Docker, because you would have already learned Docker, so you'll know the Docker swarm already in that process, but learn Kubernetes. So that is the overall funda. You start learning on each and every step. You start learning one tool, and you should be really familiar with some sort of automation scripting. It can be Bash, it can be PowerShell, or it can be Python. So one of the scripting is a must. So this is the journey, guys. You start familiarizing yourself with what is CI/CD. I've already done this. Now, in this video, we just touched base on why we use DevOps, what is DevOps lifecycle, what is CI/CD process. In the CI/CD process, I explained build, release, test, monitoring, what are different tools, and which tools you should really learn and how do you start your DevOps journey. I hope this video helped. If you have any further questions, please post down your comments, and I'll try to cover it in next video. Thank you.